The date is June 28th, 2013. This is episode 19 of Let's Talk Bitcoin. Making it up as you go. Coming up on today's show, Stephanie's back from Porcfest. She tells us all about it. Ever heard of a woven bacon sandwich? You will today. Listener mail, open garden availability, and the various options on the market for cold storage. I sit down with Jeff Coleman from the Bitcoin Alliance of Canada for an interesting, if tinny, discussion of the MBIT. What it is, why it's important, and why you might want to change your wallet right now to use it. And then we've got a trifecta of stories about various governmental organizations declaring things about technology they don't seem to understand. And finally, we talk about the apparently racist history of marriage licenses, and the first, quote, seizure of bitcoins by the DEA. If you're new to Bitcoin, check out letstalkbitcoin.com/learn to be directed to the Bitcoin Education Project. If you like what we're doing, please review us on iTunes or your preferred podcast platform. This helps others find the show, but just generally we really appreciate it. We do an hour-long show twice a week. That's a lot of content, and it can be overwhelming to new listeners. I'm excited to announce a brand new tool to help share the show called givepodcast.com. Using your phone, just take a screenshot of your podcast player at the time you want to share, email the image to clip@givepodcast.com with the description in the subject and the email address of the friend you'd like to send it to. The service grabs a 10-minute clip of the show starting from the time indicated by the screenshot, hosts it, and emails it to your friend in a nice clean format. This is an experiment. Please give it a try and tell us what you think. Hi, and welcome to Let's Talk Bitcoin, a twice-weekly show about Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies, and the future of money. If you're brand new to Bitcoin, please visit letstalkbitcoin.com/learn to be directed to the Bitcoin Education Project, where you can find free classes and lectures that take you from brand new to expert in no time flat. My name is Adam B. Levine. I'm a writer and speaker who likes to talk about complicated topics in understandable terms. Money is abstract, and cryptocurrencies don't help with that problem. But you know what does? Discussion, and looking at the situation through many eyes. Joining me for that discussion, Andreas M. Antonopoulos is an expert in decentralized networks and system security. Hello. Dr. Stephanie Murphy is a scientist and syndicated radio host.
Hi.
There's lots on the docket today. Let's talk Bitcoin. Stephanie, you've been away for the last week. We were running pre-recorded shows last week because you were at Porcfest, which is a liberty-oriented event. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, well, first, for anybody who's wondering about the name, it's short for the Porcupine Freedom Festival. And the reason it's called that is because it's an event that's put on by the Free State Project, which we've talked about on this show before, which is a movement of basically liberty-loving people to move to New Hampshire and get active for freedom in whatever way that means to them. The Free State Project puts on a couple of events a year, and one of them is Porcfest, which is a camping festival. It's held in northern New Hampshire, beautiful area, White Mountains. When you think camping and in the middle of the woods, you're thinking, well, how's Bitcoin going to work there? Because the internet doesn't seem to be too reliable. And it wasn't. I mean, the campground has a meager internet connection that totally gets flooded by the, second day of Porcfest when people start to get there. But fortunately, there was a Bitcoin-only Wi-Fi network that some Bitcoiners brought. I think it was BitInstant that actually brought this Bitcoin-only Wi-Fi network that helped people do Bitcoin transactions so that they could connect with their phones or computers to different Bitcoin websites and wallets and web wallets and the Bitcoin client, Electrum and Qt client and so forth. Bitcoin was hopping at Porcfest, even in the middle of the woods. And you go to Porcfest and there's on the order of like 1,500 people camping at this one campground, and all of them are self-identified as libertarians or liberty lovers or freedom enthusiasts, whatever you want to call it. I'm not talking about libertarians like the political party, just people who like human freedom, essentially. There are talks and speeches, dance parties, all kinds of stuff. I taught a yoga class, and I was helping run the first aid tent, which we have volunteers who provide, voluntary first aid to people who need it in the woods, and like preventative stuff like bug spray and tick removers and sunscreen and, all kinds of goodies. So that's kind of what it's like. And you walk around this campground and there's a place called Agora Valley, which is like a row of campsites with people selling stuff and people displaying their various projects and having booths that are associated with their projects. And in Agora Valley, it was full of Bitcoin stuff. I mean, basically, I've been going to Porcfest for many years. Every year I have a blast and love it. But in the past, I've noticed that people, who go to this event are really into alternative currencies. And in the past, they were using a lot of silver rounds to trade, like to buy food or t-shirts or, whatever they wanted to buy that week. And so there were lots of different silver rounds circulating in the past, even some copper rounds. But this year, there was so much less silver and copper and so much more Bitcoin. It was just really interesting to see because people seemed to be ditching these physical metals in favor of Bitcoin. Not everybody has cell phone service up there in the middle of the woods, but Verizon was able to connect to 3G. And then some people had this app called Open Garden, which is a mesh networking app, which allows you to connect to the internet through other people's devices. And we've talked about mesh networking on the show. So that was helping some people get online. And of course, there's this Bitcoin only Wi-Fi that was helping out people with Bitcoin transactions. So I didn't even see any physical Bitcoins the whole time I was there. It was all people sending Bitcoins to one another, and it seemed to work out really well. It always is a fascinating culture when people come together for Porcfest because libertarians have a little reputation for being a little wacky, and it's a very colorful group of people, and it's 1,500 people, but yet everybody comes together and it went pretty smoothly. Like I was running the first aid tent. We didn't have any serious injuries. We were there for a lot of people who had minor things, and that was nice to have volunteers helping out with that. But they were also very generous and, gave us Bitcoin tips and gave us cash donations to cover the cost of supplies, first aid supplies that we provided and stuff like that. A couple of people recognized me from Let's Talk Bitcoin. That was cool. I remember last year at Porcfest, Bitcoin was just starting to come out on the scene. Actually, funny story. I talked to a guy who was a friend of mine, and he said that 2 years ago before Porcfest, so it would be exactly 2 years ago, he was mining Bitcoins, and he was mining like a block a day with his Pentium 4 just on a CPU. And he was getting like 50 Bitcoins a day. Eventually he was like, I don't know if this is worth the electricity, and he kind of stopped, but he had those Bitcoins stocked up, and now he's really glad he saved them. And now he's kind of squirreling them away on paper wallets. So there were a lot of like Bitcoin early adopters there, and people who are really excited about Bitcoin. And I remember last year at Porcfest, Mandrick, he has a business called George's Famous Baklava, and they don't just sell baklava, they do all kinds of food, but they were doing food vending in the pavilion, which is like one of the main areas at Porcfest. Last year, he was selling these sandwiches called a train wreck, and it's basically bacon weaved together into a mat. So like he literally weaves the bacon, and then and then on top of that, you can put all different things like gyro meat or like vegetables, lettuce, tomatoes, and onions and sauce, and it's really, really good. But he was selling those for about 1 Bitcoin last year when they were worth a little over $6, I think, at Porcfest last year. And so, he hung on to those Bitcoins, and now that's $110 sandwich or whatever. And then this year he did he did the same thing. He was doing food vending and did a lot of Bitcoin transactions. There were QR codes everywhere. There's a big computer screen with a QR code where you could pay for any kind of food you wanted, a train wreck omelet, all kinds of stuff that they had, a really professional setup. And I think he did, a couple hundred Bitcoin transactions, not a couple hundred Bitcoins worth of sales, but a couple hundred transactions. So I think, Bitcoin was tremendously successful, and really interestingly in this environment that's in the middle of the woods. And I was just fascinated by that because it shows that Bitcoin can work anywhere if people are interested and have the drive to do that.
So I have a couple of questions here. If Bitcoin was being used as a primary form of payment, one of the things that people talk about a lot, even in context of, a city where there's lots of internet connectivity, is the relative slow speed of confirming transactions. And how that's not really conducive for a retail experience where, you want to buy something. It's not like you can just hand somebody the money. Instead, you have to hand them the money and then they have to wait like 5 minutes in order for a confirmation to come back. Was there any kind of problem with that you ran into? Was it even something that people, considered or talked about?
I didn't hear anybody who was worried about that. I mean, I did buy a couple of things with Bitcoin while I was at Porcfest. The merchant would always see the transaction pop up right away, and then they would kind of trust it. It was usually people that I knew, or at least, we weren't going anywhere. We were at the same campground, so
right.
It's not like I was going to walk out of a retail store. So it's a little different in that respect. There was the Lamasu machine that came to Porcfest. They had Revolution Coffee set up, and then they had the Lamasu machine at the coffee shop where they were out, at a little tent site in the middle of the woods, and that was cool. And
could you remind our listeners what the Lamasu machine does?
Yeah, absolutely. The Lamasu machine is a Bitcoin vending machine, and it was invented by a couple of guys who I know in New Hampshire, Matt Whitlock and Josh and Zach Harvey. And they developed this device, which is really cool. You hold up a QR code to it and you say, okay, I want to send the Bitcoins here. So you can hold up your phone or a piece of paper or a card or whatever. And then you feed cash into the machine. It recognizes the cash, and then it will send Bitcoins to the address that you specified. And you cannot get cash back out of the machine, but you can change cash into Bitcoin. And why would you want to do that anyway? And that was working out in the middle of the woods. Most of the time, the internet was fine for that machine to work. It didn't seem to be a problem with the confirmations. I don't think anyone was really even paying too much attention to that.
My understanding of how Bitcoin was working there is that you said that BitInstant provided essentially an uplink, right? They provided,
yes.
And then there was Wi-Fi there. So now I've been having this conversation on and off with a few people. In a situation like that, where there is only one essentially way out, isn't it possible for like a bad actor to essentially sit on that line and to be able to read transactions coming in and pre-spend them before they go out? Aren't there security implications from only having one way out to the broader network?
If you can become the only node that provides information about the blockchain, the only node that can be contacted, either by blocking out other nodes or effectively by spoofing other nodes, you could potentially mislead the entire Porcfest community to go on a forked blockchain that was not related to the real blockchain, and then double spend everything on the real blockchain, or on the majority consensus blockchain, I should say. Essentially, you can create a localized illusion and then double spend that on the main blockchain. But it would take quite a lot of work to do something like that. Well, one of the good things about Porcfest and that particular community is that most everyone there would probably have access to guns. So, yeah.
I don't know if that's a good thing, but yeah, there were some people with guns, and maybe an element of social ostracism if somebody was actually doing something malicious and it was found out. I do have a quick correction though. It was not BitInstant who provided the Bitcoin only Wi-Fi. It was actually Lamasu. My bad. I got that mixed up.
So if they're the primary source of Bitcoin and actually taking fiat in the meantime, it would really be bad for their reputation to try to double spend that. I think that's a good combination. It aligns their motives. But again, this is a really minor use case or possibility. It would take a lot of really hard work to do it, to pull something like that off.
It relies on you being really remote too. I mean, it relies on you having so few connections out that you only have one or two.
You expect that no one can go on the Verizon 3G network that you said was there, for example, and figure out that in fact the transactions are not going as they should be going. So that would be a bit difficult, although you can spoof cell towers. I think the bottom line with these things is that it's a rather remote possibility and would be found out relatively quickly.
And just picture the horror movie trailer now. Out in the middle of the woods with a bunch of anarchists and no internet. Somebody tries to do a double spend, but they're quickly found out.
Yeah, exactly.
We saw actually a lot of Bitcoin businesses who were, I think, trying to establish their reputation or, maintain goodwill within the community. Eric Voorhees was there from Coinapult, and he actually sponsored a dance party on Saturday night where he was DJing, and that was a lot of fun. And then there was the Bit Tent, that was sponsored by some Bitcoin businesses. So there was a huge Bitcoin presence, and I think it's only going to grow at Porcfest from now on. And it was just fascinating to see the difference between last year at this time and this year at this time, and how far Bitcoin has come and where will we be next year.
See anybody grumbling while you were there? This new Bitcoin thing, I'd rather be using silver or something like that, or did it just sort of fade?
I didn't hear anybody saying that, but I guess maybe I just missed talking to those people who weren't interested in Bitcoin.
I think it's lovely that you got people who are really skeptical, especially about money, to show such a willingness to embrace this currency. Because, effectively, they very much don't believe that fiat is viable as a currency, right? I think that's one of the foundational beliefs. They don't trust in fiat or in the government that backs the fiat. So, persuading skeptics is, I think, a pretty good milestone.
So if money is an illusion, then Bitcoin is an illusion that you get to basically make up your own mind about how you want to see it as. This is especially true when it comes to denominations. And so even though the common way that people like to think about Bitcoins is as a whole Bitcoin, and then if I have a fraction of that, then it's some decimal point. So I could have 0.01 Bitcoin or 0.001 Bitcoin. But there actually is another way to think about it. You can think about it really as, you can take the decimal point and move it wherever you want. There are implications to that. It changes the way that you think about it in your head to a certain point. I'm here with Jeff Coleman. He's a board member for the Bitcoin Alliance of Canada. We've been talking about this idea of when it's appropriate to shift your perspective, and specifically to move to the mbit. So, Jeff, why is this something that should be important to people right now?
Well, Adam, I think it's mainly just a usability issue. We're starting to see that with Bitcoin staying for long periods of time at around $100, it's just not practical to price small items without having a trail of points and zeros in front of them, and that's just not user-friendly.
I'll agree that that's not user-friendly, but do you think that there's any kind of conflict here with the direction that development has been going? Because, it seems like, you're right. It doesn't make a lot of sense to have a Bitcoin that's worth $100 be the standard unit of accounting, because a lot of transactions happen at a level that's below that. But at the same time, is there a differentiation where we have to stop paying attention to numbers because they become dust, because they become not to the point where they're usable? As a community, how do we go about making a change like this?
I definitely don't think it's at odds with any of the development approach. In fact, the major clients are all integrating support for the mbit right into the software, so you can just switch it and see everything in there. That's definitely far above the threshold that they're looking at when they're saying that something is so small, it's dust, that it's really in the way, and it's not an advantage to think of that unit. So that's definitely at a much lower level. But you raise a good point, which is that there's kind of two things going on here. There's practical usability of something, and there's our mindset of how we think about something. There's kind of two ways you can approach the whole mbit thing. You can say, on the one hand, I'm going to think about everything in terms of mbits. If I had 100 Bitcoins before, I'm going to think now that I have 100,000 mbits. Or I'm just going to use this as a tool the same way I would switch back and forth between kilometers and meters according to what kind of a distance I'm talking about. And I'll use meters for small distances, and I'll use kilometers when I'm going on a long trip. And you can apply that kind of mentality to Bitcoin with the mbit and the normal Bitcoin without necessarily changing your mindset at all.
That's a really interesting perspective on it. I hadn't thought about it in that way, but that makes a lot of sense to me. One of the interesting parts about this change is that it's not like somewhere in the protocol someone flips a button and then suddenly everybody is switched over to this new unit of measurement. It seems like it's almost a chicken-egg problem, because if vendors aren't offering product at a certain number of mbits, then users don't think about the number of mbits. Instead, they're thinking about the fractions of Bitcoin. But at the same time, if users switch over to thinking about the fractions it seems like both sides have to come together and make this change at basically the same time in order for it to be an easy change for anybody to make. Have you put any thoughts into how something like this actually is going to happen? Because it certainly, theoretically, if Bitcoin is going to succeed, we have to have these redenominations where the number of Bitcoins doesn't change, but it's just the way that we look at them and the way that we divide them changes. So how do you think that we get to that place?
Well, Adam, I think it can look like a chicken and egg problem if you view the problem as how do we get everybody to start using this new unit. I don't think that's necessarily the problem. I think that the problem is how do we get people informed and comfortable with the new unit so that whenever it comes up, it's intuitive to them. As long as we solve that problem, then people are going to use whatever the tool is for the job. And myself, I see a bit of a trend where for normal everyday things, we're going to start using the mbit more because it's so much more intuitive than talking about 0.0 this and 0.015 that. But I can still imagine scenarios where someone, if you have 10,000 Bitcoins, you're probably not going to switch over to thinking of that as 10 million millibitcoins. But it's totally up to you. And that sort of differentiation between the two roles, I think, is perfectly fine. So then you don't have so much of a chicken and egg problem of getting people to switch. It's just a matter of getting people comfortable with something different so they can use whatever's easiest for them.
I can see that part of it, but this is something that I've come up against, and I can't imagine I'm the only one. There are some services out there that have switched to talking about mbits, especially like micro-tipping services. The Reddit bot is an example of that. They talk about mbits a lot, and I believe that there are some tipping services out there besides that, but I can't recall them off the top of my head. And that's been confusing to me because I'm used to looking at Bitcoin, and so when I see these other numbers, it doesn't really, it takes me a while to click, and it's hard to kind of do the math, which is funny because obviously it's just moving a decimal point. But I have had a little bit of a difficult time with this. Do you think that there are ways that we can improve usability on this, or do you think this is just something where people just have to learn and it will happen eventually?
I think a lot of it is just making the choice that makes sense. Like I said before, with meters and kilometers, if you're talking about a small amount of money, it just makes sense to use mbits. There's no reason to involve decimal places and things like this. And if you're talking about a larger amount of money, of course it makes sense to talk about bitcoins. But when you get to that underlying mental problem of how does it become intuitive to me, how does it start making sense to me, I think you're onto something there. And I think for myself, what I had to do before my own mental switch happened was to go through and change all of my software and change everything to working in mbits. And then it started to make sense to me. Oh, of course, this is about how much an mbit is. I started to get an intuition for it.
So it's just about immersing yourself into it, basically, and making that the new normal for yourself.
Definitely. And also, I mean, we're using the term mbit, and I think something simple that's easy to say and think is really important. If you're thinking about this as a millibit coin, I mean, that's just like 3 extra units to hold in your brain at the same time.
So let's talk about that, actually, because, mbit is one of those things that makes sense on paper because it's totally accurate. It's a micro, right? Not milli? I can't recall. It's one of the two.
It's milli.
It's milli. Okay, so it's milli Bitcoin. Okay. It just seems to me that there's a problem with the names because the names aren't crazy intuitive. It's not like, a buck. It's not like they have multiple syllables. And so what I've been thinking about, for like the Satoshi unit is you could call that like a tosh or a tosh or something like that. Something one syllable and easy to sort of associate that is meaningfully different from Bitcoin.
Adam, I think you brought up a great point there with the word buck, which is that nobody instituted the word buck as slang for dollars, right?
That's true.
It's something that spread on its own just because it was easier. For myself, when I first started thinking about different possible names for the unit that is 0.001 bitcoins, none of the names were intuitive to me. None of it made sense to me. At the beginning, I was thinking, oh, well, maybe we're going to call them millicoins, or we're going to call them millibitcoins or millibits, or all these different things, and it was totally impossible to me. But then after I just sort of immersed myself in the conversation, all of a sudden mbit just became this natural thing to say. And I didn't even intentionally think I was going to be using the word mbit as much as it turns out I have been.
Yeah, it's funny, definitely. Going into this conversation, I wasn't sure what we were going to call it either, but mbit is like the easiest thing of all of the ones, while still kind of indicating, in fact, what it is, even if you don't know what it is. When did you think this is the time where we need to start seriously considering this? Because, it's something that on the show we've talked about, especially early on. We haven't gotten to it recently, but it's been a question. We receive all these microtransactions, and it would be a much bigger number, certainly. It would be a much more interesting number if we were talking about donations in terms of mbits rather than in terms of fractions of Bitcoin. But at the same time, we haven't made the switch yet. So what was the meaningfulness for you? Was there a number in particular? Was there an event?
This, to me, is where we very naturally touch on M-Day, which was, of course, on June 2nd, talking about, like, when does this switch occur? And one of the things that's come up as a natural milestone is that it's been 2 years since the mbit passed the U.S. cent. This is something that we have a word for. It's something that we use all the time. I'm not an American myself, but this is the world's most circulated currency, so it's a great gauge of what a natural unit is. If it's been over 2 years, I think that's a pretty good indicator that it's time to start thinking about it. But I think we had this underlying feeling, the volatility in the exchange rate, is this going to stay? Are we going to go back and forth a little bit here before we move forward? Like, when is this really going to be here? And now that we're seeing a really prolonged stay at a larger valuation, it's starting to make a lot of intuitive sense.
So when you say a higher valuation, I'm trying to figure out what the number is. You're right. The US dollar isn't the only thing out there, but it's kind of the standard as far as monetary units are concerned because it's something that most people can reference, at least their own currency against. For me, it's been about these $100 marks, right? I kind of feel like we've got one naturally that occurs at $100. We've got one that naturally occurs for the next redenomination at between $10,000 and $100,000. I'm not exactly sure where it where it makes sense. But I mean, do you think it's that sort of progression that we have to see? And so does that mean that we have kind of a more natural future of these ahead of us? Once we've made this switch once, all the other switches will become more natural and easier?
I think there are a lot of people better qualified to talk about that than me, and that would be anyone who lives in a country that has gone through redenominations before, because these are not uncommon in the world's currencies. We have situations where either because of deflation or a change in the pegging of a currency or something like this, we have a shift in numbers that happens. And people in those countries can tell you that they probably do get used to it after a while. I don't know if we're going to have to get used to it. I mean, the difference of moving from the Bitcoin to the mbit and moving from the mbit to something another, say, 3 decimal places over is quite a radical difference in terms of the overall growth required in the Bitcoin economy. It's a much smaller difference to go from $1 per Bitcoin to $1 per mbit than it is to go from $1 per mbit to $1,000 per mbit. Whether we'll see that in my lifetime, I mean, that'd be a great thing. It'd be a great problem to have. And if we have it again, I guess we'll get to it when we get to it.
Right.
But it is a much larger leap. Like, the nice thing about the mbit is it's kind of in the middle there. As long as we stay above $10 US per Bitcoin and below about 100,000 US per Bitcoin, it's still roughly usable.
So for somebody who's listened to this conversation and would like to change their client themselves so that they can start thinking about Bitcoins in terms of mbits and multiply their holdings through doing so, in their head, can you walk us through how someone using the standard Satoshi client would make this change?
It's very easy because this has been built in by people doing the development work. So if you've got the standard client and you just go to the settings menu and go to the options, you'll see a display tab there. And when you click on that, there'll be a section that says unit to show amounts in. And one of the options there is MBTC. So you just choose that one, hit OK, and you're good to go. It's really that easy.
And for people who aren't using the Satoshi client, is there some place where they can find out more information about this?
Definitely. And in fact, that's why we've set up the website mbit.org. That's em-bit.org, just to provide instructions for different clients, to answer some basic questions, to provide some graphics, just those sort of resources for people. So if you're using blockchain.info or Electrum or something like that, we've got the instructions up there for you too.
You said that there are some complexities to people switching their businesses?
I think that's something that we forget a little bit in this conversation, which is that we can talk about what we want to use as units. We can talk about the community in sort of a general sense, but there's really 2 very different types of situations people are faced with. One is, am I going to switch my own personal client and change the way that I think about this? And the other is, if I have a public-facing website, when does it make sense to denominate my prices or my values in Bitcoins versus in mbits? And that's a very different thing. And that's one of the reasons that I set up mbit.org and launched the MDay program, so that we can raise the level of awareness to a level where it'll be practical for businesses in these public-facing websites to use these denominations in regular pricing. If I'm a business owner or an exchange owner or someone who's selling anything in Bitcoins, I might look at my webpage and I might say, oh, well, 0.01 Bitcoins for this, that doesn't look very good, and I prefer to use mbits. But then I have a question of, are people going to actually know what this is? One of the things that I'm also going to be doing over the summer is running some surveys just about general awareness. Like, if you see something priced in an mbit, do you know what that cost is like? Does that make sense to you? Just to help provide that level of user research for businesses who are asking that question. And then also we want to provide graphics and just simple things like that makes it easier to brand your website. So
the making sure that your customers understand the thing that you're actually trying to convey to them is really important, because otherwise you've just taken what is a very small fraction, which might seem reasonable to some people out there used to thinking about Bitcoins, and instead you've replaced it with, 100 of this other unit. And if they can't tell that the other unit is worth a lot less than the unit that they were displaying a fraction of before, then that's a problem for pretty much everybody involved.
It is, but there's 2 things that make this a lot easier for Bitcoin than it would be for changing any other currency. The first one is that if you're selling something in Bitcoins, you're generally selling it to people who know a bit about Bitcoins. Like, it's a little bit of a specialist community. People who use Bitcoins are obviously a little bit ahead of the curve. It's still such an early technology. It might be something that they've been brought into by a friend or a family member, but chances are if they have been, then that friend or family member is an expert. So they've got a much closer relationship to knowledge and expertise in Bitcoin than someone does with, say, a dollar or sort of a currency like that. So that aspect helps a lot. And then the second aspect for businesses to consider is if you've got 0.010 something, that's already a bad problem from a user friendliness point of view. That's already something that someone who isn't totally comfortable with SI units or decimal places or these sorts of intuitions is already going, what is this really worth? How much is this? Is this a good price? Is this a bad price? So that's an existing problem that can be reduced just by switching to the Mbit. So those two things, I think, make it a lot easier for a business selling things in Bitcoins to make that switch than it would be if we had to adjust the dollar or something like that.
Right. That makes sense, certainly. So you said that, in the past, you've had Mbit Day, and you've got the mbit.org. I'm sorry, mbit.org or mbit.com?
It's mbit.org.
Mbit.org, okay. And you've got the mbit.org site. So what's next in this movement? Are you continuing to have public outreach? I mean, is there a plan for another Mbit Day, or are we waiting a year for that?
Well, Mbit Day, I didn't choose Mbit Day. Mbit Day is June 2nd every year.
Oh.
The reason for that is it's the anniversary of when the Mbit first passed the U.S. cent. This year was the 2-year anniversary M Day, and next year will be the year 3 M Day. It's just good to remind people that, if we're asking this question, we've been asking it for a little while. So it's good to keep track of how long we've been asking this question. So by the time we roll around to Mbit Day next year, do you think that this will be pervasive, or do you think that it's going to take a while to bring people on board? We'll have to wait and see, but my personal intuition is that if we get around to another year and we've kept the valuation in ranges where Mbits make the most sense, people are going to realize, hey, I already heard about this a year ago. We've been wondering about this for a year. It's probably time to make the switch. So there's a sense in which it's never too early to start thinking about this stuff and start informing people, because even if it does take a while for everyone to build that intuition, then they'll be able to look back and say, oh yeah, we have been talking about this for a while. Jeff Coleman, mbit.org, embit.org. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it, Adam.
Let's Talk Bitcoin is heard each week by thousands of people who are participating in the new digital economy. Our listener base of Bitcoin owners, miners, investors, technologists, and merchants is growing fast. We offer a limited number of short advertising slots in each show to keep our listeners engaged and to provide maximum impact for our sponsors. If you'd like to talk to us about Let's Talk Bitcoin, send us an email at sponsors@letstalkbitcoin.com.
If I showed you a website where you could easily purchase electronics from the world's largest distributor with Bitcoins at 0% markup, would you think it was too good to be true? Good news. It's real, and it's at bitcoinstore.com. Choose from 500,000 items, save money over Amazon and Newegg, and convert your Bitcoins to real-world items. You can even buy with privacy. All they need is a shipping address. But don't take my word for it. See for yourself at bitcoinstore.com.
So last week, I spoke with Stas from OpenGarden. Stephanie mentioned that OpenGarden was an application that was used for people who had any sort of connection to essentially create an ad hoc mesh network that they could then use to maximize their internet connection, what internet connection they did have, while they were at Porcfest. That's basically what the service does in general, no matter where you are. We got a listener question that said this: I find the potential of mesh networks really interesting. Anything distributed in public has to be good, right? The OpenGarden project seems interesting, but it's blocked by AT&T, my carrier. I fail to see the point of mesh networks if they can be shut down by a carrier. And he goes on a little bit from there, but the important part is we reached out to Paige from OpenGarden, who's their community manager. She basically said that while, yes, it's blocked in the Google Play Store, you can still visit opengarden.com and download it directly onto your device from there. So even if you have a carrier that doesn't allow it, so long as you can access the internet, they can't actually stop you from using this program. Just go and check it out at opengarden.com.
Can we say Apple... yay for Android there? Because that's the way you get it on there, because Android's open, so yay for Android.
I received an email from a listener that I thought was perfect to talk about on the show. We get a bunch of questions on Let's Talk Bitcoin, kind of like, well, I'm just getting into Bitcoins and I want to know how to do this specific aspect of Bitcoining. And I love to talk about these questions because I think people want to know, but maybe are afraid to ask because they think it sounds like, a newbie question or whatever. But, no question is too newbie for us. We love to talk about everything. So thank you for this question. So the listener writes, my question is, how do you transfer Bitcoins from an account on your computer to a paper wallet? Please make it as simple as possible as I'm not that tech savvy, and go into as much detail as you can or give examples. Andreas, do you have any examples?
Sure. So the paper wallet itself is really just a way to store keys. And so each paper wallet has a public address, which is the same as your wallet address. It starts with a number 1. It also has a private address that's hidden, preferably covered with some kind of security sticker to make sure it can't be compromised easily. So the way you send to it is rather simple. The way you would send money to a friend, you would get the public address off the wallet, and you would update your address book on your online wallet, and then you would just send Bitcoin to it. Now, that Bitcoin essentially gets locked on the blockchain with the paper wallet key and just sits there on the blockchain until you unlock it with the other part of the paper wallet. So the nice thing about that is it creates some interesting scenarios. For example, if you're using the safe paper wallet or open paper wallet structure, which disclaimer I've built with community support, you end up having a backup stub. And essentially that means that you can send Bitcoin to it magically. And if you have one paper wallet in your home safe and one in a bank safety deposit box or in somebody else's safe for safekeeping, essentially you're sending the money simultaneously to both locations. And that's an interesting phenomenon. You can't really do that with physical money or even wired money. So you can do backups with that system. So yeah, it's as easy as sending to an address. What gets a bit more difficult is when you have lots and lots of paper wallets. It becomes somewhat difficult to remember which address belongs to which wallet. And for that, we've now got some new software released at Open Paper Wallet that gives an alias to each wallet. So basically it combines an adjective, a color, and an animal name. So your wallets, instead of being named 1QZ35B, they're named Cuddly Purple Lion and Sneaky Black Viper or whatever. And so that way it's easy to remember and easy to find in a stack of very, very memorable names.
Open Paper Wallet has a lot of different features that I think some other paper wallets don't have, but it's worth mentioning that there are other types of paper wallets out there. For instance, blockchain.info, popular web wallet, and they have a way to export a wallet to a paper wallet, and they have, pretty much step-by-step directions on the website if you have a wallet there. There are some other wallet websites. The names are escaping me right now, but
let me help you out. There's the grandfather of them all is probably bitaddress.org, which is also the one that we used code to derive Open Paper Wallet. Both are open source. So bitaddress.org. There's also bitcoinpaperwallet.com, which is developed by Canton, who's a well-known community member. And of course, the original Casacious paper wallets that were developed by Mike Caldwell. So there's actually a pretty big field, and all of them are open source, and all of them are kind of swapping ideas around and bits of code. So it's developing very rapidly.
There is another option that's not really the same thing as a paper wallet. It's more like a paper backup. But if you use the Armory wallet, then you have the ability to print out essentially uncoded versions of your private key, which is a little bit different than a paper wallet. Paper wallets usually incorporate some sort of security features, but as far as just a straight backup that you can tie to your existing wallets, that's another way to do it. But it's not the same as cold storage.
So yeah, let's clarify the difference just briefly. A paper wallet that's a backup of an online wallet allows you to recover it if the online wallet gets destroyed somehow. However, it doesn't take your Bitcoin offline. That means it's simultaneously accessible either from the online account or the paper wallet. A cold storage paper wallet, the only place those keys exist and the only place those Bitcoin are tied to is the paper wallet itself. So you literally move things offline and then you can only access them with a paper wallet. And that's a slightly different model. It depends on whether you want to do safe long-term storage or backup.
Yeah, I think that's a great explanation for anybody who's curious about that. And if you have any more questions, let us know. You can email us at
mail@letstalkbitcoin.com.
Last week, an overzealous attorney at the financial regulators here in California sent a cease and desist to the Bitcoin Foundation to tell them to stop trading virtual currencies. Of course, as is obvious for anybody who knows what the Bitcoin Foundation does, they don't actually trade virtual currencies. So this was a bit of a weird situation where it's almost like a scare tactic. And I think a lot of people would probably assume that a lot of these letters went out based on a keyword search. But nevertheless, it created a big scare across the Bitcoin industry, causing people to wonder whether they could get wrapped up in this overbroad regulation about who is and who is not a money transmitter. Just as a little aside, I looked into this and I found out that the National Money Transmitters Association does not have a money transmitter's license. Of course they don't. They don't transmit money. They're an association. But, you know,
but that's a perfect analogy.
It is, isn't it? And it's interesting to know that in this particular fight, the Money Transmitters Association is actually an ally, because they've been almost hounded out of existence by these overzealous regulators that are trying to block money transmitters from operating. And as a result, money transmitters have a lot of difficulty opening bank accounts, and their bank accounts keep getting frozen and seized even if they're operating with a license. It's interesting because we think of money transmitters as the ones who are fully compliant with the regulations and on the side of the man and, playing the game based on the rules. But they're getting hounded just as much as virtual currencies by the banks, who really, really have no interest in getting competition from these little players.
But aren't those the banks? I mean, aren't the banks also money transmitters by the definitions that we're talking about?
Yeah, the banks are money transmitters, but the banks don't want other money transmitters who are not banks playing in their playing field. So they basically don't let them open bank accounts, which is kind of amusing, right? It's the same game that they're playing against Bitcoin. I think this cease and desist was just a misfire, and probably the attorney who sent it had no idea what Bitcoin is or what the Bitcoin Foundation is. But, we're going to see a lot of these silly moves by underinformed public bureaucrats who just send these things out because, to them it has no cost. It's career brownie points, and all of the costs and panic and damage to business is caused to someone else that they don't really care about. We're going to see a lot of these stupid moves.
Well, fortunately, I see not many people taking this letter very seriously, which I think is a good sign. Although I could see how it would be really scary, and it seems like just what we see over and over again. There's big businesses, big interests that are basically have the regulators on their side in their pocket, and they want to keep competition out.
Well, the regulators are operating like a guild. I mean, effectively, they don't really enforce any regulations on the big banks. We've seen that again and again. And they don't really protect consumers, and we've seen that again and again. So what do they do? Essentially, they keep out competition. They keep the rabble out.
They send out letters, Andreas.
Right, yeah. But who do they send out letters to? They don't send out letters to HSBC money laundering billions. They don't send out letters to people who are rigging Libor. Or they don't really attack any of those targets, the mega criminals. They really only go after those who are trying to encroach on the lucrative business of the bank. So the regulators, in the end, are guilds, in the old feudal sense.
A big problem here is, like you said, Andreas, it's a really, really overbroad law that seems to be the one that they're potentially out of compliance with. Looking at the people who were actually behind both the letter and the law, it's actually the same guy. So he may not know what Bitcoin is, but from the perspective of knowing what the law does or doesn't apply to, he probably actually has a pretty good idea of what's going on. If you look at the specific statute that's referenced, 18 USC 1960, there's a clause in there that actually is about defining who is or isn't, who falls under this ruling. And it says, Clause A, whoever knowingly conducts, controls, manages, supervises, directs, or owns all or part of an unlicensed money transmitting business. This is actually a point that was brought up by Aaron Greenberg, who in California has a lot of experience with these financial regulators and how many problems they can generate for new financial businesses. Because the foundation has some prominent members in it, all of whom are actually exchanges, and some of them are unlicensed, as by the definitions of this in California, there is some question about whether or not the foundation, even though they don't do any money transmission themselves, because of the ownership structure they have, they still might fall under this. And then even beyond that, there's a question of how much of Bitcoin, quote unquote, they have the ability to control or not. And again, where that standard sits with regards to how this rule applies.
Here's the thing. I mean, even if the entire management team of the association was owned by the exchange players, which it isn't, there are board members on the board who have nothing to do with the exchanges, and there are plenty of members, including myself, who have nothing to do with the exchanges. So the idea that you can basically say that the law extends also to the professional associations that have nothing to do with the management of this just because their members are part of this, it makes a complete mockery of the law, because it's so overbroad that it would basically touch anyone by association. And by the way, association is a protected right under the First Amendment and is one of the core parts of the First Amendment. So the ability to create a professional association which does not control exchanges is a protected right. You can't just barge in there and say, hey, you're an exchange. Well, there's a burden of proof. So even if the law is constructed over broadly, that doesn't mean it can be enforced as such, or that the foundation or other organizations like that don't have a very clear affirmative defense that this is an association protected under the First Amendment, and the regulator can go stuff it.
So on the topic of continuing news in the space that doesn't really do much to add to the conversation, but that warrants a brief response, the G8, the group of 8 largest or most, what does the G8 actually describe?
The 8 largest economies in the world.
In their recent publication, released an article entitled Protecting Digital Economies that is not tremendously long, but is long enough that it's not worth reading the whole thing. The important takeaway from it, there's this push in the international community, or at least in the international governments, to really take a hardline approach to online crime. And the problem with this, of course, is that anything that is outside of the existing financial system is viewed as something that is a boon to online crime because it's more difficult to track since it doesn't go through the couple of existing global payment processors in Visa, MasterCard. I'm sure that there are others besides that, but those were the 2 that were specifically mentioned in the list. With that in mind, what their recommendation is to just flat out ban not just Bitcoin, but any sort of alternative payment mechanism that doesn't have this type of thing built in, where it has to go through a nexus point, where it has to go through some place where the identity of the people doing the transactions can actually be determined. Because if you don't do that, it makes it easier to conduct online crime. So
I guess we're going to have to ban
cash. Is there even a response to this? Yeah, I mean, that's the thing is, it's the cash argument, but is that a fair argument? Because it is transmissible in a way that cash isn't over distance.
Well, I mean, I love the report should probably talk about protecting from digital economies rather than protecting digital economies, because
right.
It's about protecting banks from digital economies. And that's the bottom line. Certainly when they talk about the greatest threat being terrorism, espionage, and online crime, I don't know. I was around in 2008 and none of it was terrorism, espionage, or online crime, unless you consider all of the stock markets as online crime, in which case, yeah, absolutely. That wasn't the major concern of global economies. Here's the thing. I look at this as basically dinosaurs braying at meteor trails, right? They're making a whole lot of noise, but in the end, their minutes are measured. Their time is coming to an end. And, and I'm not talking about the G8 in general, but this kind of bureaucratic, close-minded, old-school idea that if you're not part of the system, you must be evil, and if you are part of the system, you can do no evil. Well, people see through that. There's an entire generation of people who think that's just ridiculous. So I really wouldn't pay any more attention to this. They misdiagnosed the problem, and therefore all of their solutions are completely irrelevant.
Good luck banning all online payments that don't go through some kind of trackable processor. I mean, I think it's great that people are not going to take this very seriously.
It's wonderful, the hubris that goes into assuming that they even have the power technological capability to do that. If you bray loud enough at the meteor trails, maybe the meteor is not going to get you.
Continuing on with quick hitting this news, we talk a lot about the U.S. because there's been a lot of action recently in the U.S., but Germany has just come out with an interesting determination with regards to the taxing situation for Bitcoin. To summarize, if you hold Bitcoin longer than a year, then it's no longer something that is subject to capital gains transaction. Andreas Peterson alerted us to this morning. The question here is, what happens if the infrastructure that develops, if the regulatory system that develops is totally different from country to country? I mean, does that matter to Bitcoin? Is it just local complications, or does that actually create a problem or a good situation further down the road?
It's no different than any other financial system. There is no global set of regulations, and that's probably a good thing because that leaves room to maneuver and alternative approaches and interpretations, as well as local experimentation. It seems that Germany is doing things that are more conducive to long-term holding of Bitcoin, as well as using Bitcoin as a store of value. Let me just point out, this isn't very different from what's happening in the US. So the current law in the US is that capital gains income from assets held longer than 1 year are generally taxed at a long-term capital gains rate. And that means that if your total income puts you in the 10 or 15% bracket for earned income, then you pay 0 on those capital gains and pay 15% if your income puts you in the 20 to 25 bracket. So even in the US, long-term capital gains have special treatment, and that's a good thing. It encourages people to invest more in the long term, which in the case of Bitcoin also aligns nicely with the deflationary principle. You can call it hoarding, or you can say this is a currency that encourages savings. I think that's a great development. And, over time, I think we're going to see these regulatory environments that are more friendly to Bitcoin attract more Bitcoin investment. And, if California keeps braying at meteor trails and sending scary letters, all they're going to do is make sure that this is not the place where the next big Bitcoin thing happens, and Germany or Japan or someone else will scoop us.
I have a slightly different perspective on it. I think all of these things, anything that government does, is interfering in sort of the natural state of things, if you will. So a capital gains tax is an interference with the market, with the natural state of things. And, removing that for assets that are held more than 1 year is another, interference. And they're just kind of pushing and manipulating the market in different ways. And in reality, we don't know what's best. I mean, who is a regulator or a government person to say that I think you should hold your Bitcoins for more than 1 year, and I'm going to try to incentivize you to do that because I won't extract quite as much money from you if you do. No, they don't know the right decision about that. The individual knows the right decision about whether they want to sell their Bitcoins 2 minutes after they got them, or to hold on to them for a year, or to hold on to them for their lifetime. And so, anything that government does is really just pushing people further from, being able to make those decisions about their own money in a kind of uninterrupted and natural way. I mean, yeah, it's great that, people might be able to get around or to get a little break, I guess, from this tax system in Germany. And yeah, perhaps there'll be Bitcoin holding funds that pop up in Germany, and people will store their Bitcoins long term there and maybe can get away from some of these regulations. But I would like for everyone to just be free of them in the first place and be able to make their own decisions about whether to spend, save, give away, or do whatever with their money that they please.
That wouldn't be very profitable for the big banks, though. So, you're gonna have to find a way to elect people who don't work for the big banks. Good luck with that.
I don't want to elect anybody.
I know. I mean, that's the bottom line, isn't it, though? The problem is these regulations and all of these tax incentives are basically all aligned to keep the incumbents powerful and protect their business models at the expense of any innovation. And that's the bottom line. So yeah. Yes, of course, Bitcoin is going to run head on into these regulations simply because it can't be easily pigeonholed into one of the classic, 4 categories that the regulators understand. It's a new thing. And it's the same as what we saw on the internet. For the first several years on the internet, people were trying to figure out whether this fell under the regulation of fax machines, the regulation of TV systems, the regulation of telephony, or the regulation of cable TV systems. And of course, it didn't fall under any of those. So now we have a patchwork of regulations over the internet that are becoming increasingly draconian, but none of them look anything like what they were in the first decade. I think we see the same thing in Bitcoin. People can't really figure out where it fits. And so you're going to get this patchwork where different decisions as to where it fits result in different regulations. That's probably not a good thing in the long run.
Now there's a way to buy Bitcoins with your credit or debit card. btcquick.com. Simply become a member of their Bitcoin Buyers Club and you'll be eligible to start. Unlike other services, you don't have to wait 3 to 5 days. Your Bitcoins arrive within minutes at BTC Quick and are delivered through encrypted private keys that you control. If you want to buy Bitcoins with a credit or debit card and don't want to wait, BTC Quick is for you. Check it out today at btcquick.com.
You're listening to Let's Talk Bitcoin, the premier audiocast providing news and insights that cover the rapidly evolving world of digital money. Our twice-weekly show include analysis of late-breaking news, updates on key technical, business, and regulatory issues, and in-depth interviews with the key people driving the new digital economy. Let's Talk Bitcoin offers sponsors an attractive way to reach a targeted and savvy audience. For more information, email sponsors@letstalkbitcoin.com.
You know, this may be getting off into the weeds a little bit, but I'm just going to put a thought out there. There was a recent decision, I guess, of the Supreme Court in the U.S. ruled unconstitutional the Defense of Marriage Act, which is, you know, kind of laughably named, basically saying that, I guess I'm happy about that, although I'll share my thoughts more about that in a moment. But, you know, basically what this law that was struck down did, or the Defense of Marriage Act did, was say that states and the federal government don't have to recognize marriage contracts between gay individuals that were married in another state. And so, you know, that means that straight people enjoyed some privileges for like immigration purposes, for tax purposes, hospital visitation, all kinds of things. And those were not, the same ones were not extended to gay couples. So that was struck down. I like the idea of not having discrimination, but really what the whole government involvement in marriage is, you know, them trying to incentivize with all these tax breaks and all these, you know, special things that married couples get that single people don't get. What they're doing is incentivizing what they think is a good decision, what they think is moral, what they want people to do. And I'm sorry, but the government doesn't get to decide how I'm going to live my life. And, you know, to incentivize something that they think is moral, it's just like incentivizing saving, so-called, with tax breaks for holding assets for a long time. Maybe that's not a good idea for everybody. Maybe getting married is not a good idea for everybody. And they should be free to choose that on their own without this pressure from outside.
You know, I think it's important to look at the historical context, because the government didn't start off issuing marriage certificates. That was something that was handled by local religions and things like that for quite a long time. They only got into it in the last, I believe, 150 years. The reason why was because there was a need for a continuous registry, right? There was a need to make sure that there wasn't overlap. And so really it's done on a state by state level. We don't even have a federal, you know, system for marriage as it stands now. Is this another candidate for something that could have the function taken over by a block application, where instead of having, you know, registering with whatever particular state you're in, you know, and getting a marriage license there, instead you search the blockchain and make sure there's no conflicting entries on it for either party, and then you're able to essentially add your marriage onto there. Could this go through that channel?
I don't know, but I would love to marry like 4 women on the blockchain all at once. And I'm going to be doing that as soon as it's possible. You know, Adam, I think the reason that marriage licenses first came about, I mean, there's a reason that government issues licenses and permits. And that reason is so that they can deny them if they want to. I don't think it really had much to do with keeping records, although I'm sure they like to do that. But as I understand it, the history of marriage certificates and marriage licenses in the U.S. was a very racist one. And they would deny certificates to people who were, you know, to couples who were like interracial. And the whole purpose of having marriage certificates was so that they could deny them to some people. And, you know, of course, there's money that goes along with it. Now, when you get married, you got to pay a fee. And in some cases, you have to get tested for certain sexually transmitted infections like syphilis, which is incredibly uncommon now among straight people. And so it's just ridiculous. It comes with all these antiquated things and fees for the state and reasons that they can deny you. Just the whole idea of begging the government for permission to make a private contract with someone else and say, I would like to have a committed relationship with you and here are the terms. No, I'm not into that idea.
I would very much second that. My interest in activism in the DOMA case came from the simple fact that less than 50 years ago, before Loving versus Virginia, thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Loving, my marriage was illegal. And, that kind of rubs me the wrong way.
Why was your marriage illegal?
Because according to the standards of the day, my marriage is an interracial marriage. So up to 1967 and Loving versus Virginia, I would be banned from marrying my wife. And that simple realization that I am currently living a marriage that just 50 years ago was illegal is really, really a strong motivation to not ask, but demand that others have the ability to do that. But you're right. I mean, at the end of the day, marriage licenses were all about stopping miscegenation and all of these bizarre ideas about purity of race and all of that. That's what it was always about. It's either about property, chattel, or about basically denying access to that institution.
I saw an interesting meme on Facebook the other day saying something like, if you want to know why we have passports, just ask Edward Snowden. Because of course he just got his revoked. And so that's why ultimately we have any kind of permission slip from the government.
Do you know when passports was started?
Passports? No. When was it?
World War I and in the preamble to World War II. And they were all about stopping flows of Jews from country to country, from being able to escape the control of government across borders. So yeah, a lot of the government institutions have their roots in very, very, very ugly forms of discrimination.
So most of the time on Let's Talk Bitcoin, we talk about stories that have been making the rounds because we're not a tremendously timely show. But in this particular case, with some of the new writers I'm working with for the original content blog that we're going to be launching soon, Brian Cohen stumbled across essentially a DEA confiscation report that was a single line and 106-page long document that pointed out, we think is the first, seizure of Bitcoins by a federal agency or by any sort of agency. This is not to say, and this is something where there's a lot of confusion about, this is not to say that the Bitcoin protocol itself was broken or violated or some exploit was found. More than likely, what's happening here is we're working with really incomplete information, and so we're having to piece together what's going on. What we do know about this that's emerged since we broke the story a couple of days ago, it is definitely a Silk Road transaction that generated this. The guy in question goes by the name Casey Jones on the Silk Road forums. We managed to track down, with the help of some listeners, who he actually was, and we also have the court records of what he was arraigned on. And so it does look like, in fact, this was simply a honeypot. So basically what it looks like happened is that the DEA set up a fake selling account on one of these illicit black markets that operates on the Tor network. One of them is called Silk Road. Another one is called Atlantis. I think there's Black Market Reloaded. That's a third. We don't know which one it is. We do know that the person who was involved was at least active on Silk Road, and there they were selling a couple of various types of drugs. The interesting part about this case is that after the DEA took control of the Bitcoins, as detailed in their report, it looks like the Bitcoins started going through a whole bunch of transactions. When we started looking at the story, what I was expecting was for the Bitcoins to make one or two jumps maybe, and then just sit there because they're evidence, evidence that was seized in a case that can essentially be returned to the owner if the owner applies for it, because for these to be seized, there doesn't even need to be any charges filed. Instead, there needs to be a suspicion that something happened, and then they're allowed to preemptively grab it and then, figure out later what to do with it. But what actually happened in this case is that the Bitcoins, once they go into the DEA's account, move through a whole series of dozens to hundreds of mixer transactions. So we were actually unable to track down more than about 2 Bitcoins of the 11 Bitcoins total that were seized. This has some interesting implications, both on the what the heck are the DEA doing with the Bitcoins, but it also has interesting implications. Are these black markets that are supposed to be safe even actually, do they have the potential to be safe, or does the anonymity work in both ways so that, whenever you do any sort of transaction that involves your address, you're putting yourself at a lot of risk because these agencies are active out there?
Well, I think the other possibility is that the DEA never actually had these Bitcoins to start with. We can't tell for sure if any of these addresses were owned by the DEA. So here's a slightly alternative scenario. This is where the DEA arrests or arraigns this person, and then they pronounce, "I seize thine Bitcoin in this address." And, in the banking system, when they pronounce, "I seize thine dollars," things happen. Banks freeze accounts, things happen. In the Bitcoin space, of course, that pronouncement had zero impact. And so there's a really good chance that Eric just moved the money.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective, because all the DEA seizures that I've heard of, just nightmare stories where somebody is driving in a car and has a bunch of cash on them for some reason. I remember hearing a story of a guy who was moving across country and he had basically like his life savings with him in cash, $10,000 or $20,000, and got pulled over by a cop. What they do is they'll charge the money with a crime, and it'll be like a USDA versus $10,000 in cash, and they'll seize it. It's called asset forfeiture. They can take, cars, anything that they believe was involved in a drug transaction. But they can't do that with Bitcoins. I mean, I don't think they could anyway. What do you guys think?
There are a couple of scenarios here. If you seize the computer, then, and it's unencrypted and you've got a wallet on there, then technically, you have seized the Bitcoins. It's just a question of whether or not you have the, you have the know-how in order to move them to some place that you control. Andreas, I think that's a really interesting point that you made, about the seizure. Maybe it's just an on-paper, fiat thing, where they say this is the way it is now and then expect things to happen. But because Bitcoin works differently, maybe they didn't happen. The part that makes me think that this is not a situation like that is that the 11.02 Bitcoins that are referenced in this came from a wallet that had 40 Bitcoins on it in total. So I've got to imagine that if something is going to happen, it's going to happen to the entire amount on the wallet rather than this small transactional amount. It's $1,000 at the time or $800 worth at the time that this transaction was made. But, why wasn't it the whole thing if it's in fact the DEA trying to grab it all?
Who knows? I mean, it might simply be that the person involved used a separate destination wallet temporarily for the transaction itself, and that's the only one that they knew to seize. So who knows, really? I mean, the bottom line is that asset forfeiture laws, as well as money laundering laws, are basically a way for the state to shift the burden of proving an actual crime to the money that finances potential crimes. And so as a result, they increasingly move law enforcement away from the crime itself, which is perhaps the possession of narcotic substances or the sale of narcotic substances or whatever else it might be, to the money flows themselves. And of course, the money flows don't have equivalent due process rights, and asset forfeiture is a very, very big sledgehammer with which the government can basically not only take the money out of circulation, but also strip the defendant from any opportunity to defend themselves by taking away all their money so they can't pay for lawyers. I mean, that's the other pernicious aspect of asset forfeiture. I mean, to me, asset forfeiture is a completely draconian, Kafkaesque, and somewhat totalitarian approach to law enforcement. It shifts the law enforcement from the action, which is actually the crime, to the transaction, which is very closely associated to freedom of speech and association. It's more thought crime than crime. We see this across law enforcement nowadays. It's a lot easier to go after the thought crime than the crime itself.
That goes back to what we've talked about a couple times on the show now about, is so-called money laundering a crime or any kind of financial crime? Isn't it really just speech? Like if you've harmed someone, that's the crime. It's not necessarily money being moved around.
Well, it helps also expand the definition of crime until crime is whatever the powers that be say is crime, and whatever you think is crime really isn't. It creates a two-tier justice system where at the bottom you can have zero tolerance asset forfeiture, guilty pleas and plea bargains with enormous threat behind them. And at the other end of the scale, you can have discretionary forgiveness, zero punishment instead of zero tolerance. It basically bifurcates the justice system and creates these really, really weird and perverse incentives for law enforcement. And you could go back to the discussion we were having before. The war on drugs is really a racist institution, both at its birth and at its current implementation.
Yes.
They certainly don't stop cocaine snorting bankers when they can stop and frisk 800,000 minorities from Brooklyn.
The most appealing part about Bitcoin to me is that lack of arbitrariness, the lack of ability to make rules that apply to one group differently than other groups. As we move forward, we've now seen this in money. I think that money, Bitcoin accomplishes for money this sort of agnostic, neutral thing that we like to talk about, where it's a protocol, it's a platform. The rules are the rules are the rules. I'm really, really curious to see if this exploration of money as a neutral platform can be eventually transposed into other parts of life, like drug policy, just like government in general. Any place where there are rules, it feels like this sort of everybody is treated the same because we're all the same at a basic level, and therefore we should all follow the same rules at a basic level. And if some people shouldn't follow the rules, then maybe there shouldn't be a rule against it in the first place.
I think that's a great insight, Adam. You know, the bottom line here is that neutrality as expressed in Bitcoin means that it's not about the sender or the recipient, it's about the transaction itself. And the transactions are not discriminated based on sender or recipient. Now, in a society where you have the rule of law rather than the rule of man, an empire of laws rather than men, as the founders used to say, equality of justice for all, or equality of application of justice, then Bitcoin would be a perfect fit because it fits with those principles entirely. Now, if you then assume, well, why are we having all of this friction with Bitcoin? Part of the reason is that the rest of society is no longer a rule of law society. It's very much about who is the sender and who is the recipient and how much power they have. So in that context, Bitcoin seems incongruous. It doesn't fit into the model of the existing financial and banking system, where you can make quick determinations about who's good or bad, not based on what they do, but based on who they are.
Thanks for tuning into episode 19 of Let's Talk Bitcoin. Whether you liked, loved, or hated the show, we want to know what you think. Please send all comments, questions, and offers to help to mail@letstalkbitcoin.com. If you like what we're doing and want to support us with Bitcoin or Litecoin donations, please visit letstalkbitcoin.com for episode-specific addresses. If you've got a question you'd like answered on air, call us at 1-855-WE-TALK-BITCOIN. Thanks to Andreas M. Antonopoulos, Dr. Stephanie Murphy, Thomas O'Brien, Michael Megan, and Jeff Coleman for providing content for this episode. Music for this episode was provided by Jared Rubens. For more information about the music we use and the open source artists who create it, please visit letstalkbitcoin.com/music. Stay tuned for episode 20 coming up on Tuesday, the 2nd of July, featuring more discussion and interviews. Let's Talk Bitcoin is a startup, and I'm actually looking right now for people who can potentially fill in the gaps in my skill set. I think I'm pretty good at this show thing, and I think I'm pretty good at this journalism thing. But when it comes to business decisions and when it comes to technology decisions, these are not exactly my strong areas. So no promises, but if you're interested in this sort of thing and looking for a project to throw yourself into 100%, you can contact me at adam@letstalkbitcoin.com.